Hello, welcome to Keys to Unlocking Educational Success webinar series dedicated to transforming education so that more children can be successful readers and learners. And today we have with us Ann Edwards, who so graciously is volunteering her time to be with us and to cover the topic of phonemic awareness. But first, Ann, we want to start by sharing with the listeners how you came to be an Orton Gillingham Fellow and a little bit about your background. So would you mind just taking a minute and sharing some of your personal story, how you came to be doing what you're doing today?
Sure. Well, I started in the field approximately about 30 years ago, and at the time I had been at home raising 6 children and decided to go back to school and finish my degree. When I got there, I decided to take education because truthfully I didn't know what else to take. And as I progressed through it, I went on to get a master's, and I got it in reading, which at the time was basically whole language. The whole course was done in whole language. So when I came out and I got into the schools, I saw that whole language wasn't working for many of the children, and I wanted to find another way. And I went and watched one teacher who did Orton Gillingham, and I knew it as soon as I saw it that would be effective. So that started me basically on a 30-year sojourn into the field of dyslexia and learning-based language disabilities and dyslexia. So that's where I come from. That's my background.
You know, Ann, you so gently put in there that you were raising your 6 children, and oh, I decided to go to school in one sentence.
Right.
That's amazing in and of itself. You had 6 children, and you had the energy, strength, and ability to go on to school.
I did, because I guess maybe I wanted to get away from the children a little bit, you know, and that was a good way to do it. But teaching had never been in my plan. I just got there, and that was what was accessible to me at the time. And once I did it, and I got into the schools, and I saw that so many children couldn't read the way I was doing it, the way I had been taught, then it started to get very interesting to me. I got very interested in why smart people couldn't read. And that's how I got into the field.
And let me ask you this, Ann, what type of degrees did you get? What was your area?
I had a bachelor's in elementary education and a master's in reading. And with a master's in reading, I had truthfully no idea how to teach someone how to read. I realized when I got out into the field and with actual children, I mean, everything sounded good in the classroom, but when I got into the schools and I saw the kids and I started to do what they had told me to do, and when you go to school old, you do well, because you know it's kind of insulting not to do well. And I knew what I was doing, and it didn't work. And then I started to see, you know, there's got to be another way. Aside from the fact that I had one of my children, it didn't work that well with either. But I don't think he was dyslexic, but he still struggled a little bit in the beginning. But some of these children in the schools, they just didn't get it at all. And then you're left with, I don't know what to do. You know there's a hole, you just don't know how to fill it.
And you said something I'd like to go back and ask a little bit more about as well. So here you are, you have a master's degree in reading, and you realize that education didn't prepare you to teach reading to children who weren't getting it for whatever reason, right? It wasn't identified. We use the term dyslexic, and some may use that as a term that means not reading, but you weren't, you just knew that the techniques that were given to you weren't helping them to crack that reading code, right?
They weren't. And I also have special education. I have a double there. I have special education and reading, and neither one of them, you know, gave me the skills that I needed to work with the children that I faced in the classroom.
Okay. So I think, and this is the first part of our series, and we're going to talk about phonemic awareness. But I think what you're saying is so important for our listeners who are both parents and teachers to understand. For a parent to hear the teacher trained with a degree in education and a focus in special education and reading saying, I wasn't given the toolbox to help those kids who weren't learning to read. And for you teachers who invested in this, you'll know exactly what Ann is talking about, that you will have children that you don't know how to reach or what they need. Now, Ann, you mentioned something, you saw someone teaching using Orton Gillingham. What did that mean to you, and that it was working? What did that mean versus something that you said was whole language? I want to make sure that someone listening would know what you mean by whole language.
When we do whole language, you rely very, very much on a child's visual memory. And if a child doesn't have a good visual memory, they have a problem. When I saw the lesson done with Orton Gillingham, it did not rely on memory. It was very skill-based. It gave them a toolbox. It gave them something to do when the memory failed, that they could actually work out a word and figure out what it was with the tools given them. And once, I tell this to the teachers I train, you can watch Orton Gillingham and you can say it's difficult and you can say it's a lot of stuff to remember and a lot of stuff to do. But I don't think anybody can watch it done and think that it won't work.
Okay.
You can ration to yourself, you rationalize this, that there's something here. There's something here that's going to work.
Okay. So, and from my own experience, Ann, I want to highlight what you're saying because when I was in school, for example, when we were taught to read, we were shown the whole word, like apple, fire pit, I don't know, you name it, wheelbarrow, and you had to memorize that word, and I wasn't able to do that. So, and I wasn't given any other tool to do that. And I remember the principal at the school I was at telling my mother that I needed to learn phonetically. And she whispered it because it wasn't allowed. The teachers at that time were not allowed to break it down into sounds and syllables. And so the principal was whispering to my mother to buy these records where I could practice this, the sounds and learn about syllables. But that's another story, but that's what you're saying. There was a time period in education when the expectation and the way to prepare teachers was through something called whole language. Now they say we used a mixed approach. You teach in the New York school systems and prepare teachers. What about what's going on today? Are they still using whole language? How different is it today?
Now they use balanced literacy, which is still basically whole language. There's supposed to be a balance in it. The problem with it is that even when skills are taught, even when we do an Orton-based word study is usually where it falls, the rest of the day you're fighting basically an opposing curriculum where that's not being used. So it's there. They try to put it in, but it's not melded into the rest of the curriculum, which makes it difficult to sustain.
And I think that's very important for our parents listening and even our teachers, because if I heard, oh, we do balanced literacy, we it sounds good. We used a mixed approach. In theory, or in just the way it sounds like it's going to be more inclusive, better. But in reality, what I'm hearing you say is still foundationally, it's relying on a certain kind of memory system. And many of the teachers aren't trained in the teaching the foundations, the phonics rules, or about phonemic awareness and so forth. So I think that's a good platform to go into this topic of phonemic awareness. What is it? how is it best taught, and what's the barriers in place, or the kind of questions we'll be addressing. So Anne, what is this first step in reading? Like, to help someone start to crack that code, the National Reading Panel report identified the first phase as being phonemic awareness. What is that?
Phonemic awareness is being aware of speech sounds. That's basically what it is. Being aware of speech sounds, that they are individual sounds that are kind of work together, blended together to make other words. That every word coming out of my mouth is made up of an individual sound that I've blended with another sound. And then the ability to manipulate those sounds, because as you read, as when you speak, you have to take the sounds of the language and you have to manipulate them. They change partners. So you have to be able to manipulate those sounds together. And dyslexia, the research has shown that one of the big problems with dyslexia is that it's a neurological break in that phonological loop, that phonological system of the brain, where the sounds are not being carried to the right part of the brain, and there's a disconnect there. So children are not, they don't get that sound symbol relationship. They don't get the fact that the word cat is made up of 3 sounds, especially when somebody's teaching it to them as a whole word. And the ability to manipulate sounds, by all the research that I've heard, is the best predictor of future reading success. And very few people do much with it.
So that means that a teacher wanting to help children to crack the reading code, the first step is to develop phonemic awareness, the ability to hear the sounds and manipulate the sounds. Is that while looking at print, or is that before you even start to look at print?
There's no visual stimulus. It's all sound related.
Okay, so without looking at anything, just hearing, it's the ability to hear the sounds and to manipulate the sounds. So if someone's not reading, does that mean it's a hearing problem? They're not hearing?
It's not that they're not hearing it. It's not being processed correctly. There's a break. There's a little break, and a little redirection in what they're hearing, and it's not going to the right part of the brain that's going to put it all together. So what we do with Orton Gillingham is we use the visual, the auditory, the tactile, and what the eye misses, the ear hears. What the ear misses, the eye sees, and the fingers feel. So we use all the modalities in order to get the senses to work for the children, and try to patch that break. And the brain is very plastic. You can build neurological networks. We build them all the time with many different things we do.
Okay. And you know, it's funny because when I first met Margaret Rawson, I remember I went out to her house, and this was in Frederick, Maryland, and my son was struggling to read, and she went like this. She said, "There's a key." She held up this pencil and said, "There's a key. Not many people hold that key. It will be, he will have to learn phonetically." And my response to her was, we don't hear those sounds in my family. I didn't know then about phonemic awareness, but it was my way of telling her that we can't manipulate, we don't hear those sounds, and can't manipulate the sounds together well. And that turned out to be very true. In our family line, we're very dyslexic, and we're really unable, we struggle with that. And it isn't because we're not trying. It's not because we're deaf. It's not because of anything other than that neurological wiring issue that gives us a hard time with those sounds. So now that we know what it is, it's the ability to hear and manipulate the sounds. How is phonemic awareness best taught? And are teachers really being trained to teach this?
It's best taught at young, when they're very young. because it's easy to do. I mean, it can go right through high school. You can make phonemic awareness and phonological awareness as easy or as difficult as you can. But we like to start it with the young ones. And one of the big things that we do in the beginning is rhyme, because an inability to hear rhyme is really a red flag that the children are not making the sound connection. But what we also have to get teachers to do is to take a step back and be able to teach rhyme. How do you teach rhyme when a child doesn't hear it, right? When they don't hear it, okay, they don't hear it. Now what do you do?
Right.
So everybody has to take a step back to really so basic foundational skills that sometimes they don't know how to do that. Even when we say to a child, my word is cat, what's the first sound in cat? And they don't answer you. And sometimes they don't know what first means.
Right.
Sometimes they don't know what last means. Sometimes they don't know what the middle means. So you have to take the time to explain all of these things beforehand. How do you get in the idea of first? How do you get in the idea of last? How do you get in the idea of the middle? How do you teach rhyme when a child doesn't hear it? What do you ask them to listen for? So there's a big foundational piece, I think, for teachers that they don't get because they don't go back far enough. They kind of start what they think is the beginning, but for many children, it's not. When you have young children, they don't necessarily understand first, middle, last. I'm going to take a sound out, leave that sound out, put that sound in. They don't get it. So
Can you have an example of that, Anne, like an exercise where you're taking a sound out and asking for the first sound? Like, can you give an example of a lesson like that?
Right. So I would say my word is man. Say the word man.
Man.
Okay. Now say it without the
Anne.
Right. Okay. So that's not hard for you, but for some children, they can't do it. You'll say it without the and they'll go ma, or they'll go now. So they can't do it. But like I said, sometimes they don't understand what you're trying to do. So there has to be a lot of modeling. There has to be a lot of doing it yourself. Remember, they're not looking at letters now. So there's nothing that you can write and then pull away. But you have to just model, go over it, all of those things that sometimes teachers leave out, or they do it once, they model once, and then they feel that that's enough for kids. So sometimes it's that they can't do it, and sometimes it's that they could get better at it if you explained it better.
Right. Now, I know it's tricky because if I take a paper and I cover my mouth and say the word man, take away the versus say the word man, take away the kids are smart. They might be reading the lips to get that, right? But if a teacher covers their mouth and then asks, you'll really be able to tell who can discern those sounds, right?
Right, absolutely. But even if they can, having them watch your mouth in the beginning, just to see what you're actually physically doing, can be a help. And then go back to the piece of paper. Same thing covering your mouth with, you can say, are these words the same or are they different? If you say, hat, coat, they're obviously different. But then you have to make sure that the kids understand different.
Right.
That's what I'm saying. You have to make sure that the words that you're using in your questioning are things that the children know. So once you teach them same and different, then when you start to cover your mouth and you go, hit, pet, that's not so obvious. Hut, hut, hat. The sounds are not so obvious. You think they are, but they're not.
Right. And, when you think that the approach is show a child the word cat or a sentence, the cat sat on the mat, and you're exposing a child to print, assuming that if they're exposed to that and told that this word is cat, that somehow they're going to get it. And some kids will be able, through their memory, to hold on to that. But I like the way you're saying it, and you're talking about a teacher stepping way back and teaching each sound that makes up the word cat, and even stepping way back from there and trying to see if a child, before they even look at the letters, can hold on to the fact that the beginning sound is k, the ending sound is t, the middle sound is a, like, and being able to play and manipulate with that. When you go into classrooms, how much of that do you see really going on? I don't think my kids were ever,
Very little.
I don't think they were ever taught that. Maybe a lesson here or there, but not systematically.
I see very little of it going on. I do see every once in a while, I see rhyming. I never see rhyming taught. If children get it, they get it. If they don't get it, then they just say, well, they can't rhyme. But I never see anybody actually working on teaching them rhyme. The same thing, phonological awareness and phonemic awareness, I don't see it done very often in the classroom.
Right. And if it is, it's zoomed through, but with this National Reading Panel report and with the Orton, what we're calling the Orton-Gillingham approach, it really allows for lesson time in a daily way, in a systematic way, to teach this foundational tool or ability to hear these sounds and manipulate them. Can you give an example of like a rhyming lesson? Like, other than Dr. Seuss books, how would you do a lesson like that? What could a parent do?
Well, you can say words that rhyme, do this rhyme. We do a whole little activity where we have almost like a little house of different colors set up, just boxes. They're just boxes of different colors, and one would be red and one would be yellow, one would be green. Green would go first, yellow in the middle, red at the end. And then I'll say a word and I'll point to this is this sound, this is this sound, this is the end sound. And you have cat and at, these two sounds are at. If I change the first sound and it's at, and there's another one, but at. So in order to rhyme, this sound and this sound have to be the same. You know, and I'm pointing to the boxes and I'm having the kids put their hand over the boxes. This is just to try and teach them what they're listening for. Because some of the children do not know what they're listening for. You'll go, that, cat, fat, and they'll say pig, because a pig is fat. So they don't even know what you're trying to do.
Right.
So a lot of this rhyme has to go into it. They have to understand that the last two sounds have to be the same. But that means they have to know what the last two sounds are. How do they pull them apart?
Right.
Which are the last, which is the middle sound, which is the end sound. So there's a lot of pre-work that goes into it, and that's what I don't see. I don't see enough of, because the children,
Right.
many of the children don't know what you're asking for. And a lot of the time, one of the things where people start is, my word is cat. Give me a word that rhymes with cat. Now that's the most difficult to do, to actually have the children generate the sound. I'd be saying, this cat and fat, do they rhyme? You know, bat and hat, do they rhyme? That's the easiest way. When you start asking children to give you a sound, that's much more difficult. And that's where I see a lot of people start.
Right. And I think, you know, for people to really say, oh my gosh, you mean to tell me that reading is based on the ability to hear these sounds, manipulate these sounds? When people want to launch into, like, you have a classroom of first graders and you want to teach them all these words, but this is saying you have to slow the train down and set up this platform of the ability, because as you get into more complicated words or syllables, you want, and being able to spell, you need to be able to break these things down. So this is setting up that vocabulary, like you said, first, middle, last, beginning, end, all of that.
That has to be put into place.
Yeah.
Because when you read a sentence,
That's right.
The boy jumped over the fence in the park, you are manipulating sound. That's exactly what you're doing. You're taking different sounds and blending them together. And for children who do not have that visual memory, and especially for dyslexics, many of whom have reversals of letters or not everybody does, but some of them do. If you look at a word and you don't see it the same way all the time, it's not processed in the same format every time.
Right.
Those words becomes extremely difficult.
Absolutely.
And that's why we need something else to rely on other than just straight memory. It's just not.
Absolutely. And you know, Anne, the thing that I found when I was hiring teachers, many of them, because they weren't educated this way in their experience of growing up, they don't know the sounds, really the proper sounds to the letters anyway. And it's kind of like seeing someone when they sing the alphabet song and they go elemento, and they think elemento is one, you know, letter because they're not hearing L, M, N, O. They don't know a unit of.
I'm doing training with teachers, and when we teach a sound, we teach it with a keyword just to help the child. So it would be A, apple, A, and then O, octopus, just something that they have a keyword. And I cannot tell you how many times I will say to teachers, what letter makes the sound ah? And they say A. And I'll say, as in octopus. And then they say, oh, or A. And A that's a funny sound because we do say, I have a dog. That's how we say it. So that lazy vowel that's in there, that unstressed vowel, many teachers think that's the sound of A. Many. I can't tell you how many.
I know.
And for A is
So then if you have teachers who don't have the sounds and parents who don't know the sounds, and they're all trying to get this child to read, so then they're really kind of pushing the child just to memorize that word because nobody knows how to help them practice what's the beginning sound of a cat, and then and have the vowel correctly. Like we had parents at our school at home, they wanted to speed up the child's learning, so they were practicing sounds. We had one little girl and she wasn't making much progress. And I said to the mother at the parent-teacher conference, I pointed to the letter A, what sound does that make? And she goes, eh? She didn't know. And I said, so what you're doing every night is practicing, you're reinforcing guessing and you're not practicing the sounds right. And that's what's kind of undoing the ability for your child to keep going.
For many people who are good readers, in isolation, they cannot isolate the sounds. I mean, sometimes in kindergarten, we'll line up toys and just say, you know, go and find me a toy that starts with a D, with the sound D, like a dinosaur and a dog and a toy. So there are many activities for young children that we can do, but you cannot blame the teachers because the demands of kindergarten right now are basically first grade demands. They have to be reading at a certain level. They have to be doing math. They have to be able to write a little story. And for many of these children, they don't know how to shape letters. They don't know how to use a pencil. They don't know how to spell anything. So the teacher doesn't have time to lay the foundational skills that are needed because they're too busy getting them to read. And then when they hit first grade, they start to slide because all of these foundational skills are not there. And I'm sure you've seen with handwriting, which is, I've heard many places say that handwriting is busy work. Just don't do it. And when you go to write something, you don't think, how do I make an A? How do I make a D? That's kind of on the back burner of your brain. It's sitting there. You know how to do it. For these children, all of that becomes another complication. Just another complication. I don't know how to write it. I don't know how to do it. And when those things are not taught young, I mean, we get them to 5th grade and they don't know how to make letters, certain letters.
Oh, and I teach in the colleges today, and I'm writing on the board and I write in cursive. I have students who cannot read what I'm writing because they never learned cursive. Yep. And even one student said, can you read that? You know, like to another one, because they simply weren't taught handwriting. And so there's all these assumptions that this foundation is in place, and yet we're not slowing the train down enough to teach it explicitly. I see teachers, they don't know how to hold the pencil. You know, they might be holding it like this, you know, or we see that in the stores, right? When people are just, they never learned how to hold the pencil. They weren't taught basic handwriting, like you said, or to know these sounds. I want to share, I had this lovely teacher, and she was applying for a job at our school. Now, our school was just filled with just severely dyslexic children. And I said, okay, you have a master's degree in reading, and this is a school filled with kids who don't know how to read. What do you know about helping them? And she said, I don't know anything. And I said, okay, you're hired. Because at least she was honest, and I knew she was trainable, you know, because her formal education in higher ed did not prepare her. It goes to what just the beginning of what you started to say at the beginning of this interview. And I think people wouldn't believe it, but this is a structural problem. It's not just in one state or one area. It's like in our quest to get children more advanced, we've left them, only those who can kind of intuit and move along, they can go up the curve, but then we're leaving whole pools of children behind who can't do that. They have to have explicit instruction. I mean, you must see that all the time in the schools.
All the time. And I had someone from one of the colleges in my classroom who was in education. And they said to me, you know, this has to be in our school. This has to be part of our college curriculum. And I said, I agree with you. Who's going to teach it? And there becomes the problem, because just getting a PhD does not mean you know this.
No, that's
Mean that. So there's nobody, there aren't that many people who actually have the skill that can teach it in college. I see that because I see them coming out of college now with little bits and pieces of what they say is Orton Gillingham,
right.
And they don't know anything. They don't know it at all.
So, you know, for me, when we use this term Orton Gillingham for our listeners, I think the piece I want to highlight, the way that I would define this, Orton was based on a neurologist, Samuel Orton, who knew there was a science to how the brain works. He understood that there's a neurology, a brain architecture that's guiding the ship. And Gillingham was based on the name Anna Gillingham, who was an educator who knew that there was a craft and art to teaching the alphabetic code. And she reduced it down into these fundamental understandings. So when we use the term Orton Gillingham, it's combining the science, the neurology, with the craft of teaching. And Orton Gillingham fellows that I know, and the understanding of this is that you go down into the root. You go way down, don't assume a darn thing. You teach everything as a platform and then go up. What would you add to that, Anne? When someone says,
I would add that it is an approach to teaching. It's an approach to teaching. And what we do in one sentence, I would say, is we teach teachers the structural base of the language they speak. And the language is very patterned. It's very rule and pattern based. The problem is nobody knows what the rules and patterns are. I mean, how many times have people said English is just crazy? You know, it's just a crazy language. Well, we do have some 15% of it that is, you know, not patterned, that people have to memorize. But if 85% is rule and pattern based, that means I can teach you how to figure out 8.5 out of every 10 words, which makes you literate. All right. So if memory is failing, I have other tools that I can use, but you have to know the structure yourself.
Right.
And teach it to somebody else. And that's where we fall short with training teachers, is they don't know the structural base of the language. And I'm sure you know it because you worked with teachers, and now I'm in schools all the time. And 201, there are very, very few who have even an idea of what I'm talking about when I start.
Absolutely. And I think that's the difficulty. If somebody makes it through, let's say they get through school, they were able to get the skills as they needed them, acquire enough information. But what I see by students, by the time they get to college, even if they were reading at the lower grades, they may not have a strong enough foundation to be able to read these college textbooks, to be able to use language. And I know you and I will be talking about vocabulary at some time, but they don't have a deep enough foundation as the language gets more complex to crack that code and to have the skills to spell. But I want to back up a little bit to say, to address something that you were saying further, Anne, is that if we live in a generation where our teachers come out of a school philosophy that didn't teach them the foundation, there are very few master teachers who know the structure of the English language. And that can become a lost information if it's not taught and it's not being foundationally taught in college. I know in the state of Maryland, the State Board of Education required that teachers take more than one course in reading, because at the time, Margaret and I actually went before the state board in Maryland, and at the time they were only having one course in teaching reading. And a teacher held up a book and said, "This is the only book I need to teach reading." And it didn't include any of this foundation that you're talking about. And the state ruled, no, that's not enough. But then you look around, where are the teachers to train the teachers? If they didn't learn this, where are they to train this new generation of teachers who weren't raised with this information? So we have a structural dilemma that I think is hard for people to really believe and understand, right? I mean,
because if you think that whole language has been around for a good 25 years,
right,
that you have a whole generation or more of teachers who didn't get any skill base. They
that's
just
right.
didn't get it because it wasn't being taught. So they didn't get it themselves. I mean, I know that I was taught to read phonetically. I know it. I remember it. But you have teachers who've never talked about sounds, never talked about syllables, never talked about structure. And many of them, intuit the language. They're wired for language. They started to read, but they have no skills and they can't teach people.
Right.
And one of the things that I found eye-opening, truly eye-opening, is I always think that people understand, adult people, teachers, magic E, where E will make the A long in a word like tape.
Yeah.
I just see what happens when you assume. And I said that once at a training, this is, we all know magic E. And I'm not kidding you, when about 10 hands went up out of 20 and said, well, I don't know magic E. And
right.
That was eye-opening to me. These were the teachers. These were not the kids. So how are you helping a child who has a problem if you just know all these words, but you don't know how the words work?
Right. Absolutely.
So you have a generation of teachers that weren't taught it on their own coming through the system, and they're certainly not getting it in college. They're not getting it in high school, absolutely. And in college, you get theory. You get a lot of theory in college,
right.
Not skill.
Absolutely. And probably, sometimes the least trained in this is a special ed teacher.
Mm-hmm.
So spending more time with a special ed teacher who's learned, about accommodations and legal responsibilities behind an individual education plan and so forth, doesn't give them the skills to teach the vowel sounds, for example. So I know Margaret Rawson would say, teach the language as it is to the child as he or she is. Now that's a big ability to be able to do, because first that means teach the language as it is, you have to know the structure of that language. No matter what country you're from, or this webinar series is provided internationally. So depending on what country or what language, this applies to any language in the world. A teacher has to know the structure of that language, teach the language as it is to the child as he or she is, meaning not all brain architectures are the same, wired the same for language, but they can be taught, but they may require different methodology to do that. What I love about Wharton Gillingham approach is it uses all the modalities at once. You see it, hear it, say it, write it, all at once. So you're not really parsing out, oh, this child, you're using all you can't miss a child using all the modalities at once, right?
Ways information goes in.
Right.
It goes in through your five senses. So if we use the five senses, then we're, other than taste, you should be able to hit the right thing.
Right. It's good
Also,
teaching. Yeah.
When you're learning in high school, or wherever they teach it now, if you're learning Spanish or if you're learning French or if you're learning a different language, they do tend to teach structure when you're learning a foreign language. The only place we don't do it is with our own language.
Oh, but I'll tell you, I've been in ESL classes and oh my God, it's whole language. They give these kids these sheets to memorize whole words.
About English, they're teaching English like that. But when you go into, if you're in high school and you're learning Spanish, you do get sounds, you do get structure. They do break it down. But for some reason, we don't break English down. And part of it is, I don't think enough people understand how to break it down.
Right.
That's the problem.
I agree. I mean, you and I we agree, and we hope that the listeners, whether you're a teacher, we're not being critical or blaming you. But we're hopefully taking the stress off of you because you realize you're not alone. This is a systemic issue. You may not have been given the full toolbox. There are ways that you can go get this. You might have to go outside of your formal education to get it, but you can be diligent and
it's definitely not the fault of the teachers.
No, it's not. And as a parent, you need to know what you're up against. Even if someone waved a magic wand tomorrow and said all schools are required. I mean, they've tried to say schools are required to teach to all types of learners. I mean, it's written in the laws, but the system isn't understanding where are the teachers, where's the program, where is the successful evidence-based practices. If 40%, no, how does this go? And 60% of fourth graders in this country today are not comprehending on a fourth grade level.
Right.
They're not able to do it. And if you're from a disadvantaged environment, that's 80%. Something isn't working, and it's not the
tell
kids.
somebody that there's a problem.
Right.
And what happens is every year, this is what I try to tell teachers, every year the programs change. They have a program come in for a year, and then in another year it's gone. They have a program come in for a year, and another year it's gone. The language doesn't change. The language is what it is. It doesn't. If you would just teach it directly the way it is, you wouldn't need all these programs.
Right.
Because they all try to teach the same thing, but they come at it from very convoluted, mixed up ways that the children don't understand. And where it starts, we give kindergarten a whole year with the children to teach them these foundational skills. That's what we want kindergarten to do.
Right.
It never used to be that we used to teach reading in kindergarten. We never used to do that. We used to wait until first grade to teach children to read. Number one, because some brain structures are not ready. They're not really firmly connected till 6 or 7. All right. They say that the nerves that you need to read, the structure doesn't fully develop the way it has to be between 5 and 7 years old. So you have that disparity of age in there where some children develop a little slower. But so
Right.
in kindergarten, we want them to learn these basic things, sound, blending things, how to have what's first, last, alphabet, handwriting, all of those structural things, so that when they get into first grade,
Right.
they're ready to go. They have all that, but because the push is to do it so early, to have them reading and writing so early, that for many of our students, all those foundational skills are lost. The teachers do not have the time to do it.
Right.
And then the more they progress every year, you see it more that they're lacking. The
And,
lack just gets greater and greater as the time goes on.
and it does. And, you would think over time that we would be improving. But what's happened is technology is not our friend in this. This isn't a money problem or a resource problem. This is a mentality problem and a lack of fully trained teachers in this foundation of that language. And that is something that throwing kids on computers, it's not going to fix. There's computer lessons, and sometimes those sounds are wrong.
Oh, yes.
I mean, just to assume that your Reader Rabbit program, now I'm not saying anything against Reader Rabbit, but you know what I'm saying, is that some phonics toy that you buy in the store or some program on a computer is not going to fix this. I mean, this many times those sounds are wrong, and this has to be explicitly taught. And so we've pushed curriculums to be more demanding at younger ages, thinking that will get them up and running, and just the opposite is happening. We use technology, and yet we're not using it effectively and efficiently, so kids can't, it's reading for kids, but it's not teaching them to read. And you look in countries like Finland, where they're having educational success, they're not pounding the homework, they're having long recesses, teachers have preparation time, but the teachers are well trained in their language to deliver this. It's a total reorientation to education, and that's what we hope to be challenging our listeners to hear. This issue is a deep foundational problem of improperly trained teachers on the structure of the language that they're teaching, improper amount of time, focus, priority, and attention in delivering foundational skills to children and building on a solid base. It's like good nutrition. Just because you eat a good meal one day, that doesn't mean you've set yourself up. You have to eat a good meal day after day, take your vitamins, drink your water, rest to have good health. It's a progressive event rather than a quick fix, one lesson.
Well, if they don't have a good foundation coming out of kindergarten,
No.
now they go to school and in New York, they have universal pre-K, and then they have nursery that's going down to the 3-year-old. If they have not built that structure, by the time they get to first grade, it's very hard for teachers to move forward.
Right.
Very hard. And we see it in the results of testing.
Absolutely. And then we don't train the teacher. Okay, let's say you're a 3rd grade teacher, 4th grade teacher. How about an 8th grade teacher? You could have children in your classroom who never got it. It's your job to know how to look for this problem, and you have to go back and remediate. But to keep passing a child along each year until, they get to the end and you pass them through, but they don't have any skills, that's not doing anybody a favor. And we know that employers are running into this, that they don't have workers who are able to read and do what's needed.
Well, we see it, and if you have eighth graders reading at a first or second grade level,
Absolutely.
our eighth grade teacher has so much content area material.
Right.
They don't have the time. They really don't have the time. They see it, they see the problem, but when are they going to do it? They don't have any time in their schedule at all to teach reading.
You know, and when I teach college, I mean, I don't know. I don't know who's fooling who, but I go to faculty meetings and they say, you know, our students can't read and they can't write coming into college.
Mhm.
So when I teach, I teach them how to read the textbook, how to approach the textbook, how to look at a chapter. And I have to assume they can at least crack the code, but they don't even know how to approach a chapter. So I'll say to my students, how many of you read the chapter? 0 hands go up. I teach at 3 different colleges, 90 students. I mean, they're not reading. And to assume, you know, that they're reading, I'd be in trouble if I did that. So I back them up and have to show, same with writing, to be able to write.
Mhm.
So
Writing is, and I taught in graduate school, not undergraduate, graduate school. And they had to write a term paper, you know, big paper. And I handed one back to one of the students because I said, your first sentence is not a sentence. It's
right.
just a fragment. And you can go in and teach writing, and that's not a sentence. So there's basic skills there that have not been, you know,
Right.
That's foundational. It's
And I think to go back to this topic of phonemic awareness, it's a great first topic to look at, because it's saying that to prepare the soil of a good reader, you don't start by even looking at print. You
Right.
start by building a vocabulary that allows the teacher to get a child through repetition to secure their ability to hear beginning sounds, middle sounds, ending sounds, to be able to hear the sound itself, say the sound,
and move them around.
and move them around.
Right.
And I'm sure, you know, now on the internet, it's filled with all kinds of lessons and ideas, but, and some good and some garbage.
Right.
So it's a matter of discerning that. But and thank you so much, because covering this topic of awareness, sound awareness, that is the first step. Now, there are people who they can't hear, they've lost their hearing, they're deaf, or people who can't see. None of that is a barrier to reading, in the sense they may have to learn Braille, they may have to learn another system. There are ways to reroute and to bridge communication of language from one person to another, from text to a person, and so forth. But you have to know, as Margaret said, teach the language as it is to the child as he or she is. So if a child has these neurological issues, there's a way around it, but the teacher has to know what that is.
Oh, if you also think that the way we read and the way we write and the way we spell is all based on the alphabetic principle.
Right.
It's all based, the only thing we don't do is teach on the alphabetic principle.
That's so well said, Anne. Absolutely. There's an alphabetic code, and yet we don't teach the code.
We use an alphabetic code, and yet we don't teach an alphabetic code. And that becomes a problem.
Right.
And that's where it has to start. You only have 26 letters. That's it. Those are your tools. You have to overlearn them. You have to learn them in combination. You have to learn how they move, because that's all you have.
Right. And you know, in a day and age where people will say, oh, the reason that children aren't learning this is because they all come from divorced families, their family's poor, they don't speak English, the parents don't care, the teachers don't care, all these excuses and layers of complicated issues. You know, I know my mother, when she She was raised in Rhode Island. Her parents didn't, they were all immigrants in that area where she lived. You know, the parents didn't speak English. Her English wasn't her first language, even though she was born here. Everyone was dirt poor. You know, they had crawled out of all kinds of economic, social upheavals all over, you know, trauma. And they were learning to read and write. Look at the handwriting of the Civil War soldiers' letters are more and vocabulary. They all learned. Why were they learning and our kids today aren't? Because the teachers don't know how to teach language in the way they were back in the early 1900s and 1800s.
If you look at curriculum back then, it was very strenuous. But it just went out of my head what I was going to say, so I'll wait a minute.
When it was about the Civil War?
No, it wasn't about the Civil War.
I love the handwriting in those. I mean, the penmanship was unbelievable.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. That people learned a different way. In New York, we have arguably one of the most diverse populations that you can have. I mean, we are really of the height of the melting pot in New York. So many of the schools that we go into are 80%, 86%, 90% ELL, English language learners. Many of the classrooms I go into, every teacher, and there are 32 children in a class, every teacher has maybe 12 who speak no English, nothing at all.
Right.
And the way we teach, if we teach like this, they learn, and they learn quickly. They learn quickly. And it just works.
If they're properly taught.
If they're properly taught, it works.
Right. Absolutely. And that's the key. You know, more education, this push to have children even in school earlier. Mm-hmm. If they were teaching at earlier ages these foundational pieces, that would help. But you cannot assume that when you're sitting in a school, you're getting this. And that's what parents need to know. Mm-hmm. And parents, you know, and it may be hard for you as a parent to discern this because you may not have been trained this way or know what to look for. So I hope that today that we have at least raised the awareness, the consciousness of what is needed. And there are places to go get these trainings and understandings of the sounds. And I don't want to end without saying that you created the Bumpy Books series, but and
I created the Bumpy Book because I had many, when I was tutoring students, many parents who said, well, they don't want to do the cards and they won't sit for the cards and they don't want to trace and they don't do this. So I created a tactile book, and I said to the parents, just sit them on your lap and do it like a storybook. And that worked. They did it. That's the whole thing. They did it. And I have a website online, bumpybooks.com, and the sounds are there. Right? They're free. They can go on and they can just listen to the sounds. But while they're doing it, the children can trace. They see the letter. They trace it. They see the word. So it just helped with getting the kids to do it, putting them in an environment to do it. In schools, I tell the teachers, if you're going to put them in front of a computer with sound, give them the book and let them trace while they do it, because the letter is right there with arrows and directionality and everything else to help them. Because that's part of it, to get those senses working together so that we pick up on whatever's lacking and create that network for the kids.
Right. This information that you have to practice those sounds is free. It's free. It's on your website. And ideally, if you can trace while you're listening to the sounds, absolutely ideal. But even having access to the correct sounds the way you have them set up on your website for free is phenomenal. So that is out there.
And for parents, the most important sounds you're going to make are those 5 vowels. I'm sure that you know in your career and your experience that if you have someone 5 or 50, if they're not reading, those vowel sounds are not there.
Right.
They can't manipulate them. They can't make them correctly. They have to be taught. The other
They
sounds
have to be
are
taught.
not as hard to learn, but the vowel sounds are very tricky.
Absolutely. Well, Anne, thank you so much, and for your time in covering all of this today. And in closing, I want to thank our listeners for being a part of this important webinar series. Please send this information, this link, it's free, to your family, friends, and educational community members. The more people who know the truth about the necessary keys to unlocking educational success for reading, the better. And we want to help transform education back to a system that's serving children, all children, not losing whole groups of children in the process of this, and to satisfy teachers who are there committed and just need more tools to be able to do their job efficiently for all types of learners. So help us to get the word out. Take care, and be sure to send any questions you may have, or go to our info@transforming.education. All, transforming one word, .education, full word, and that will get to us. And we thank you so much for your time. And Anne, we thank you so much for your experience and willingness with 6 kids to go get more information.
12 grandchildren.
Let Anne be a model, an inspiration for you, the listener, the teacher, the parent. She had 6 children, and she went on to get an education degree and master's degrees. And still, she took the initiative to go get more information to learn these skills, and is now training teachers all over. It can be done. Follow in Anne's footsteps. Thank you so much, Anne. Thank you.
Thank you.